thank you so much. Yes, so I'm David Langlet, currently from Uppsala University, priorly at Gothenburg, and before that Stockholm University. So I know some of you, Beatrice, for example, long ago in Stockholm University. So, just as you've heard, I'm not an expert in financial regulation. Perhaps I'm kind of a generic expert in the interaction between different spheres or levels of regulation. So I started my academic career as a researcher in international law, moved on to the EU law level, and then in recent years I've been working more on a national regulatory scale. So the interaction and the dynamics between different kinds of regulatory processes is essentially what I will be, or the position or the perspective from which I will be talking. So I've called my presentation Sustainability Transition Under Siege, a Legal and Policy Perspective. And as Beatrice told us, I'm definitely not a finance law expert, but I will try to give such kind of an overarching or framing the following discussion in a broader context. And I will primarily use examples that have to do with climate and climate change-related legislation, but also, to some extent, broader sustainability, law and policy dimensions. So, there is no lack of commitments, objectives and goals, both of a political nature and those that have been put into a legal form. So, for example, we're all familiar with the Paris Agreement in 2015. After many years of hard negotiations, the world essentially was able to agree on putting numbers on this target that was decided already in 1992, that we would avoid or try to avoid dangerous anthropogenic climate change. And now, since 2015, we have figures on what we mean by that. We don't seem to be doing very well. I think most of us have probably given up on the idea of keeping within 1.5 degrees Celsius, and 2 degrees is very much being questioned, of course, also. But these are important commitments that we've also put into law in different forms. We have the Sustainable Development Goals, the SDGs. We know that many of them have implications for climate, for biodiversity, for finance, funding, resource flows, circularity. So markets, in a broad sense, are very much at the center of many of the objectives of the Sustainable Development Goals, if we are to achieve those. If we look at the EU, we have since a few years a climate commitment put into law at EU level. So by 2050, the EU says it's going to be net climate neutral and also aim for so-called negative emissions, so going below zero emissions net in the years after to compensate for a so-called overshoot. There are also intermediate targets for 2040, 2030, etc. There are sectoral targets for land use, for transport, etc. So there is really an abundance of different kinds of commitments and targets. We also have a national climate law, although it is more procedural in nature. It doesn't really put any specific figures on things. It's more an obligation on the Swedish government to pursue and to develop plans. And of course, also at the EU level, we have the Green Deal, which is a large package, really, of different kinds of legislative and policy initiatives that range from waste and circularity to climate and financial flows and measures. So it's almost all-encompassing and very complex. If we look at current events, of course, we're all aware of pretty dramatic developments on the other side of the Atlantic. The US, to us now, seems as an extreme case. The US is leaving the Paris Agreement. It's done so before, so it's the second time around. More dramatic, perhaps, is that the new US administration has explicitly denounced the sustainability goals, the SDGs. There's also a very active dismantling of climate-related research and monitoring, which of course provides sort of the physical basis for implementing policies. We need to have a knowledge base that is based on monitoring and research. The administration is actively disincentivizing or refusing to authorize non-fossil-based projects of different kinds. It's rolling back climate disclosure efforts. So across the board, really, there are different initiatives to sort of scale back on anything to do with climate and sustainability in many respects. Of course, this doesn't come out of the blue sky. The US has a long tradition of being skeptical towards multilateral international solutions and making binding commitments. If we look at international environmental agreements, we can see that the US is not a party to a large or a broad range of such agreements. If we look at free trade, although the US in some respects championed the international free trade order back in the 1940s and 50s, and also initiated the negotiations of what became the World Trade Organization in the 1990s, there's always been a skepticism towards committing to free trade rules in a legal sense. For a number of years, under both Republican and Democratic presidencies, the US has undermined the efficiency or the functioning of the dispute settlement mechanism of the WTO, etc. So there is sort of an ingrained resistance towards binding multilateral commitments. But of course, this aggressive denouncing of anything to do with climate policy, for example, that's something different and something new. So the question is this something that will be an inspiration for other policymakers across the globe, or is it more, as you might hope, a cautionary tale? So that, of course, remains to be seen. If we go back and look at the EU instead, we can see that fundamentally the EU has a very different approach to international rule and law-based rulemaking, if you like. Of course, there are centrifugal forces within Europe, definitely, and a lot of skepticism towards the EU. But as long as the EU is in place and is operating, it is profoundly tied to and based on some kind of rule of law concept, because the EU exists through international agreements. It is the treaties that make up the union, that makes it function and even exist, because there is no sort of social, emotional, if you like, entity really. Its existence depends on the institutions and the law-based structures that are fundamental. So given this structure that is the EU, within that structure, the different political decision-making processes with the Council and Parliament and the Commission have produced enormous amounts of legislation. And a lot of that legislation can, in some ways, be termed or labeled sustainability-related. So as a professor of environmental law, a few years ago, I wrote a textbook on EU environmental law and policy, and I've been figuring that I should update that book, but it's an absolutely daunting task, because it's such a huge field of law and it's happening so much all the time. New pieces of legislation, amendments to the legislation, cases from the EU Court of Justice interpreting these pieces of legislation, issues with how the EU relates to its international commitments, how the member states implement or do not implement the commitments, etc., etc. So it is really challenging to keep at pace with these developments. And of course, it comes with costs, it comes with challenges for governments, for private actors like companies, investors, etc., obviously. And that needs to be taken into consideration, and there needs to be sort of a cost-benefit analysis. And I think in most instances there is, but it may not always result in sort of the optimal balance. The EU has for a long period of time been discussing this, and there have been these drives for so-called smarter or better regulation. So in 2015, again in 2021, for example, there have been drives towards making EU regulation simpler, more effective, more efficient, more coherent, Emphasis has been put on subsidiarity, to making sure that decisions are made at the lowest appropriate level, proportionality, etc. There have been guidelines and toolboxes developed for checking that EU legislation or regulation or policies are not excessive, that they do deliver. We have recurring evaluations and so-called fitness checks of existing and also proposed pieces of legislation. So this has been a theme that we've been living with for a number of years, but it hasn't stopped the avalanche of new legislation, of course, and that's not the idea either. Then we're all aware of the Draghi report from last year, which really sort of sounded the alarm bells regarding the gap between the EU and the US and also China with respect to innovation and competitiveness. So, among other things, the report says that the EU needs to pursue its decarbonization path while preserving the competitive position of its industry. And of course, that's maybe self-evident, but it's a hard balance, and it's hard to understand how to do that in practice, how to stay true to a commitment to sustainability and climate change, deep climate change related reform of the economy and industry, while being competitive in a world where many other players may not be as committed, or maybe today not committed at all to those values. So concretely, this has resulted last fall in the so-called Budapest Declaration, where the European Council, so the highest level of political steering really, heads of government, heads of state in the EU have put out their analysis. So we are faced with new geopolitical realities, they say. That was even before Trump too. So now they are even newer geopolitical realities. Decarbonization is identified as an opportunity for Europe or EU, but also, of course, it comes with risks to competitiveness and to growth prospects. High electricity prices is something that is particularly pinpointed, and lack of natural resources internally to the EU, which exposes the EU to risks in its trade relations, of course. There are also issues with the common energy market, we know of that, and also other dimensions of the internal market that isn't functioning as effectively as they're supposed to do. So the remedies here, the measures proposed include, well, it's a range of remedies, of course, but European industrial policy, which is a contentious thing, of course. Sweden typically is skeptical towards more unitary EU-level policies in that field. But also, once more, a very strong push for simplification, a simplification revolution is called, to drastically reduce administrative, regulatory, and reporting burdens, particularly for SMEs. But there are also other dimensions here, like underlying the dual objective of strategic energy sovereignty and climate neutrality, so that these two can go hand in hand, that renewables typically enhances our ability to be independent of other regions in the world in terms of energy supply. And also circularity can support resilience, economic resilience, independence, etc. So there are strong convergences as well as there are conflicts between these objectives. So if we look then at the level of regulation and policies that have been adopted or are being implemented either at EU level or more on a member state level, we can see that we are talking about a broad spectrum of different kinds of instruments, different kinds of mechanisms. So to what is your right, I've given just a few examples of what I term enablers that are mostly focused on information, so generating, providing, reporting different kinds of information, ensuring transparency and information flows that should then form the basis of rational, informed decisions. So here we can have the taxonomy, we can have the CSRD, for example. Of course, there are some sort of binding elements in it. I'm not saying it's not binding, it's law, but the steering effect is intended to be mostly through provision of information to different actors. Then we have different kinds of positive incentives that economically tries to incentivize certain actions. So we have feed-in tariffs for electricity. Germany has run that for many years, I think Spain as well. We have green certificates, which we have been using in the Nordic region for many years to promote green electricity. I think some of these policy instruments are being a bit dated because now production costs have gone down and they have been superseded by other kinds of instruments, and we have the EU ETS too, etc. So, but we still have these kinds of positive incentives. Then we have what we may term the negative economic instruments. So we have had a carbon tax in Sweden for many, many years, which supposedly has had a strong impact on the energy mix as we see it today in Sweden. We have the crown jewel of European climate policy, which is the emissions trading scheme, the EU ETS, which is very much based on creating a mix really of negative and positive incentives, if you like. But essentially, it's about putting a price on emissions. And then we have the more hard, traditionally legal. I mean, all of these are legal in the sense that there is a lot of law behind or beneath all of these mechanisms, even if the steering effect is exercised through financial economic incentives. It's law at the base of it. But more hardcore law, it's what I call requirements and bans. We have, for example, environmental quality standards, which are much discussed these days in terms of, or in relation to water, where these have been interpreted very stringently and can have a very strong impact. And also we can see a number of instances where we have conflicts between different sort of green or sustainability objectives. Green transition of the energy system can actually be hampered by protection of water locally, etc. So a lot of increasing, we see those kinds of green conflicts. Although I would say that it's important not to lose sight of the fact that there are, of course, a tremendous lot of sustainability conflicts associated with non-green energy sources, for example. So we should not get stuck in these sort of new conflicts and say that these are unsurmountable. We have bans of different kinds. The EU has decided to phase out essentially cars that emit greenhouse gases by 2035, and that is now being probably up for renegotiation. And we can see that just very recently the Parliament and the Council agreed on amending the sanctioning regime here to get large European car makers off the hook, because they would have otherwise have been heavily fined in coming years. So we can see that there is sort of a partial rollback here. There are tendencies to water down and to navigate around some of these. Just in a second, I'll talk about the proposed amendments to the CSRD and the CS triple D, which looks a bit odd down there, but also because one of the Ds fell off. But I wasn't really able to sort of put that into this systemization in a neat way, because I started here, but then I realized that, for example, the liability schemes that are now maybe off the table, they end up more like over here. So it's a bit of an odd bird. But we can see that there are tendencies towards sort of easing, streamlining, deregulating, wherever we draw the line between these, both here and here, while we have some schemes that seem so far to be untouched, and even maybe increasing emphasis will be put on these. There are rumors about emissions trading being expanded to also cover agriculture, for example. It's been debated for some years, but I think now there seems to be more concrete ideas about how that could be done. So briefly, the omnibus package, I suppose you're all more or less familiar with that. We've already seen the adoption of the so-called Stop the Clock directive this spring. So it means that we postpone the rollout of some of these obligations to do with reporting, particularly for the somewhat smaller, not the really large, but the somewhat smaller actors covered by these directives. And then we have also proposals for rather significant weakening or watering down or recalibration, as the EU Commission says. Rather significant recalibration of these directives, which would, according to the Commission's own assessments, in in the case of the CSRD, result in reducing the number of companies or entities that are actually covered by the obligations by roughly 80%. So a rather dramatic scaling down of the breadth or the ambition in terms of coverage. Also, instruments or amendments to shield smaller companies from what they call extensive information requirements from those companies that are covered still. And for the Triple D, we can see that the proposed amendments include, among other things, that there will, in most cases, not be any requirement for a full due diligence beyond direct business partners, so much scaling down on this ambitious scope of sort of covering the whole supply chain of large companies. Also limiting the information that companies within the supply chain can be required to provide, and maybe possibly most important, scrapping the civil liability requirements, which I think have frightened a lot of companies. But these are sort of very significant substantive changes that are proposed, among other, to these directives. We have a number of other policies. Of course, you could mention the EU deforestation law that was recently adopted. Its implementation has now been postponed. I just mentioned that obligations on car makers to make their new cars increasingly less greenhouse gas intensive have been watered down, at least when it comes to the sanctioning, to give European car industry in crisis really some more time to adjust, which they haven't done before, leaving the field essentially for Chinese and other car makers to take over. And we can see, of course, on national level, the new German administration, Bundeskanzler Merz, has been signaling that they want to roll back on a number of sustainability initiatives, putting more emphasis on competitiveness internationally, etc. But once more, we have the emissions trading scheme, which is at the core of EU climate ambitions, which seems unscratched, and where we may even anticipate increased emphasis and increased scope of that. So the picture is a bit mixed, I would say. If we look at Sweden, well, we know that Sweden seems to be on a trajectory, at least Swedish, if not the government, but at least a number of public agencies says that we are on a trajectory to miss some important EU climate targets relating to transport and land use change, for example. There is a very strong push to ensure that we do not over-implement EU obligations. And over-implement means that we do not add anything on a national level, any kind of obligation that goes beyond what is really required, and that we make use of all forms of exemptions that the EU law provides. And that's been very explicit in a number of recent public inquiries, that the inquiries are to identify cases where Sweden is currently over-implementing. Sometimes the inquiries rather find out that Sweden is under-implementing, that we are not actually complying. So that's not exactly, I think, what the lawmaker was intending for the inquiries to find out, but that's also been the case. And of course, we all know that we have a partial sort of green tech backlash. At the same time, we have a lot of companies that have actually invested pretty heavily in the green transition and which find themselves at a competitive disadvantage if the legal frameworks are not being upheld and are not being diligently implemented. I mean, Volvo, for example, has complained about this weakening of the requirements of the sanctioning regime for car makers, etc. So also here we have a sort of a mixed picture. So does this matter? Well, of course, depends on who you ask and what perspective you take. The physical risks of climate change, biodiversity loss, etc., they're not going away. We have the data, even if the the Trump administration is trying to sort of do away as much as possible with the science and the monitoring. I think we are pretty secure in the fact that we know a lot about what is happening, and it's happening at a higher pace than many scientists have predicted. The deregulation agenda, I think partly it responds to very legitimate concerns partly to do with the speed of legislation, sustainability legislation at the EU level and to some extent in member states. It's hard to adjust, it's hard to keep up with the pace, to understand what all this really means and how to adjust and how to adapt. But the deregulation and the signals that are being sent, of course, creates uncertainty. What is it that we should adjust to? What are the costs? What are the amendments that are needed to comply? Is it more reasonable maybe to put our efforts into lobbying for further deregulation than to actually try to start to comply and analyze how we should change our practices? And of course, what decision you make there probably depends on, well, what kind of line of business you are in and what kind of values you have internally in your company or in your organization. So there is less need probably to preempt anticipated regulatory action. We see that literature shows that oftentimes business and private actors, they enter into voluntary commitments or they make changes in advance of anticipated regulatory change. But if we do not anticipate any regulatory change, at least not any raising of the standards, there is, of course, much less reason to take sort of preemptive steps on a voluntary basis. And it's probably easier to rather bet on further lowering of requirements and try to push for that, like the European or parts of the European automotive industry has or seem to have been doing for the last decade or so, trying to prevent higher standards rather than finding out how to comply with them and how to make a business out of them. And then, of course, there's also an issue of whether the reputational or attractiveness dimension of sustainability and ESG will remain. So that depends not on the legislation itself, but rather on the discussion we have in society at large. I mean, do we still support these initiatives? Do we talk about them as important, as something that builds our future? Or do we talk about them as problems, as costs, as putting ourselves at a disadvantage? And of course, probably reality is very mixed here. There are disadvantages in some of these policies, and there are costs, particularly in the short term, in adjusting and understanding and getting things right. And there is, I think, an increasing rift between those who have invested themselves truly into sustainable pathways and those who are more reluctant and have sort of kept the door open to step back or pull back out of this and see that they can maybe make more money in the short term if we have a rollback rather than progression in these fields. It's important always to remember, I think, that there are still, and every poll, both on a Swedish and European and also global level, seem to confirm that there is strong public support, actually, for ambitious sustainability and climate policies, which is not often backed up by strong individual action. But there is, at least on an intellectual level, strong support for policies. So now, just a very brief poll. How many are at least slightly familiar with the concept of planetary boundaries? Yes, I thought as much. So I regularly make this poll when I encounter my students at the law program in Uppsala. And of course, these are young, well-educated, supposedly ambitious adults who will go out in society and probably have influential roles. And initially I was shocked because it was like 10-15% that reported that ever having heard of the concept of sustainable boundaries or Anthropocene, for example. And in my world, I mean, that's been all the rage for 10-15 years now. How is it possible that someone hasn't heard about it? Can you go through school without hearing about it? And then I realized, and I came across this by a professor in London Business School, Ioannis Ioannou. For years, the sustainability conversation took place among regulators, investors and executives and professionals like me, of course, and you. But in doing so, we left out too many others, workers, consumers, small business owners. Many felt they were watching from the outside. The conversation became technocratic, filled with acronyms and abstractions, just like my presentation, filled with acronyms and abstractions, right. And we also underestimated the strength and sophistication of the counter-narrative. And I think that's pretty much where we are today, realizing that what seems to be common ground and all the rage maybe is in our little worlds, but it's maybe not so perceived as relevant for everyday life across the population. And I think that's one of the major challenges that we are facing today. That's not law, that's much broader than law. Yes, thank you so much for listening.
So I think we have time for just a couple of questions so we don't impinge too much down the line on the coffee break. I have a few, but do we have any thoughts or reflections or questions from the audience? Yes. Yes, I guess we're filming this, so we need to hear you.
Okay, thank you for a very interesting and good presentation first. You mentioned that the EU Commission have identified both risks and opportunities in relation to EU growth and innovation tied to the sort of sustainability agenda. I'm curious about the risk side. How would you say that the Commission is? How would you summarize how the Commission is identifying the risk side? Is it completely tied to sort of the reporting aspects of things, or how is the sustainability agenda? How is that a risk to European innovation and growth?
Well, I think the risks are multifaceted. I think mostly it has to do with cost, and cost comes in many shapes. I mean, it's about reporting, but it's also about, I mean, just a simple thing like transitioning the economy from one that is fossil fuel based to one that is renewable energy based. Of course, comes with huge costs. And if we are making that journey, but our competitors are not, or at much lower pace, of course, we are probably encountering costs earlier in time. And even if our competitiveness may then become better at a later point in time, we need to get past this bump sort of in our cost calculations. We must also feel sure that they will actually make that transition, our competitors, because if they don't, well, not only will we be wrecking the climate seriously, we will also be grappling with these costs for a long time, and there may not be paybacks. I think it's both the actual transition costs, but also, of course, administrative costs, red tape costs to do with monitoring, etc., and the uncertainty that is created. And I think actually the scaling back, although the scaling back of some of these sustainability rules and regulations may result in decreased costs in some ways, they can also create additional costs based on the new uncertainty.
Okay, I'm just going to have a question and then we break. But I think, because we can come back to some of these issues again when we talk in the panel. But I'm wondering from your perspective, being a legal scholar, having studied this for a long time, we're seeing, as we said, turbulence in this field now. There's large amount of regulation has been pushed out in the last, 5 to 10 years. Pushback from that for various reasons, and now simplification, attempts at simplification. But you also showed that the EU has been attempting to consolidate, streamline, simplify in previous instances. From where you're sitting, can you see, are there some glimmers of hope where this kind of turbulence has led to a simplification that has actually ended well for the intent of the law, as it were, in this case, more sustainability? Is there anything in the past that you can point to say, well, we've seen this before, but we actually landed sort of well?
Well, I mean, the history of the EU is one of recurring crises, of course. So the EU has pulled itself together and managed severe challenges on a number of occasions historically. I mean, I think in the 1980s, for example, many were about to give up on the EU project, and then the EU managed to launch a more ambitious drive to integrate the market further, etc., and regain confidence in the whole project. So I think the EU has the capacity if there is a political will. Of course, we are in a true shitstorm right now. For many reasons. I mean, we talk about a triple crisis with climate, with pollution, with biodiversity loss. We have rampant populism, which sort of is underpinned by political leaders who target multilateral solutions, who target consensual solutions. So I think the challenges are probably bigger than what we have experienced. there is also a lot of commitment and enthusiasm, and I think there is, and of course there are other people in the room who are better placed to say that, but I think, I mean, there is a lot of economic rationale also in many of these projects, and much of the research, the startups, the transition that is going on. So I mean, I definitely think there are glimmers of hope, but we're in for a very rough ride for quite some time. That's what I think. Yes.
Okay. Thank you. Sorry not to finish on a happier note, but I think we can come back to it to look at like what is the role of the financial markets and all of you who are in here in the room as well. With that, I guess we move to the next point in the program, which is no, it's the short leg stretcher first. That is the next thing in the mirror. So thank you. Sorry. Thanks a lot, David.